This one is gonna be me reading through these Foxfire books, and I'm gonna try out more of a soft-spoken-esque sound than normal. And what brought me to these books to begin with is these belong to my grandfather, and they're a series of books that have basically a oral transcription and pictures of old customs and things. And my grandfather was a farmer and born in 1930, so raised in a very young age in the Great Depression, and worked with his hands, and saw a lot of these old customs play out in his lifetime and ultimately come to an end. So he loved history and loved having these things documented, and as a kid I always thought these books were fascinating. I'll be honest, the wild plant foods, spinning and weaving, and midwifing, burial customs and things like that were not of interest. The first thing that's listed here is the thing that was of most interest to me was the ghost stories. I can't say I've ever had too many crazy paranormal experiences, but I've always been fascinated by storytelling, and I think that's that might be the root of it, but it's a different topic for a different day. These Foxfire series, I truthfully don't know how many there are, but I know that my grandfather at least had the first 9 series of them. This is Foxfire 2. They don't all have ghost stories in them. I only actually received from him when he passed. They passed to my mother, and I asked that I had the 2 copies that contained the ghost stories because we would read those, and those were most memorable to me. So I always thought they were pretty fascinating. One more thing is that, like I said, these things are oral transcriptions more than they are second party stories. So let me just actually go to the table of contents first, and you'll get a better idea. The front page offered some things, but all of them have different topics, and it's how to make honey and beekeeping and making an ox yoke and wagon wheels and wagons and tow wheels and foot-powered lathes. And of course these things seem so ancient, but there's some very interesting things like old-time burials, before I guess modern technology creeped its way into that industry. There are ways that people did things years ago, and of course the one we're interested in is funnily titled, and I think to some extent they use this phrase boogers, witches, and haints. And haints, I think, what they called spirits, or something analogous to a spirit of some kind. And so boogers, I have no idea. I think that's another term of ghost. I've heard my grandparents call ghost boogers before. But along with this is that, like I said, these are really old oral transcriptions. Let me get back to where I was at. And what I mean by that is I presumably think that I think they've described it at some point in these books, that they actually just have an audio recorder and literally transcribe the audio of these people speaking. And so, they, literally transcribe the audio, and so these things are written in a literal drawl, a southern drawl, and so they are using phrases that are, in some sense, if you're not familiar with really southern idioms and things like that, they kind of don't make sense. So I'll start by reading this first one here. That's, I think, interesting. It's by Annie Perry, and I think she is what we'd call a skeptic when it comes to the supernatural. So let me I'll begin here. I don't know nothing about ghosts. In fact, I never was brought up to hear ghost tales. My daddy said not to tell children ghost tales, said it'd make them afraid. So, again, this is an abbreviation of it would make them afraid. Well, I'm not afraid, but I tell you, I had a sister that wouldn't open a door and go out on the porch and get a drink of water at the well because she was afraid of the dark. Or I'm sorry, she was just afraid of the dark. Of the dark. Or said quickly, would probably be, she's just afraid of the dark. And that's how it's written. There's no such thing. So, of course, they're also speaking with improper grammar. There's no such thing as a haint. No such thing as a ghost. It's not a thing in the world but imagination. They just imagine they hear these things and they don't hear them at all. Now she goes on, now this is not a haunted tale, this is true. Maybe haunted and haunted. I just put that together. Haunted, haunted. Maybe a haint, a haunt. There's probably some root connection there, possibly. Let me start over. Now this is not a haunted tale, this is true. I was 7 years old when I started school. I had to go through the woods, through these woods over here. And everybody thought there's haints in the woods. And the neighbors, they had lots of big old brood sows. I think this is certainly a type of animal. I think it's a horse. I've heard of brood mares. Maybe brood has something to do with breeding. Sows, maybe a pig actually. Because she goes on to say, and if you caught a pig or made a pig squeal, they'd bite you. That's funny. And they say, now Annie, don't you go out there on the side of the road, them pigs on the side of the road, and go through there, and go through there, where them old souls are each other. So I'm sorry, sows are definitely pigs, I think. I say definitely, and then I think sows are pigs. I guess now I'm reading this, it makes me think of that old biblical story of the pigs. Someone cast demons out of a pig, I think. Something along those lines. It's been a while since I've read. So what she's saying here is the neighbors had a lot of big old pigs. And if you caught a pig or made a pig squeal, they'd bite you. So don't catch the pig. So she's being told by her parents not to go near her neighbors' pigs because she'll get eaten up by them. Well, she says, well, they had me afraid of hogs, so she was afraid of pigs. I'd have to go by myself to those woods over there. I'd look way out there and way out there, way out here and way out there. There wouldn't be a thing in the world. Directly I saw a thing that looked like a hog. Directly is a funny word if you're not familiar with it. It has kind of a contextual meaning of a few different things, I suppose. Here it's used in the context of in that moment, or momentarily, or something along those lines. The way my mother still uses this directly. And directly, you'll hear people of the baby boomer generation and older use directly if you're from the South, if they're really Southern. And, you know, the phrase they might use is, I was going to the store directly, which means I was about to go to the store. Or, in this case, directly I saw a thing that looked like a hog, which means in that moment, or at that moment, I saw a thing that looked like a hog. But keeping on going, I had to go by it and I was scared. Scared. I was scared, and there wasn't a thing in the world. Not a thing. There wasn't a hog within a mile of there. Just some old stumps lying there. But I guess it looked like a hog to me. Imagination. That's so now, which means she's saying that's the truth. That's so now. Not like a bratty teenager saying that's so now. Or that's so 2000s. That's so now. I'm saying the truth is what she's saying. They scared me with hogs, she's saying. They really did just scare me with hogs. And I'd look way out and I'd see something and I'd make a hog out of it. And she concludes with, now that's the way ghost tales get started. Ain't no ghost. So the moral of her story is, ghost tales aren't real. People just use their imaginations because they get all worked up about things people tell them. So that's just an interesting story. That's the one I'm starting off with. There's more. I mean, there's 40 or so pages of them. I'm going to keep going along here with Lawton Brooks. Maybe I'll not talk as much this time, but Lawton Brooks told a story. It says, about 2.5 miles out of Hayesville, there's kind of a bend in the road where a man was killed and just shoved out onto this big old white rock by the side of the road. And he died and left blood sitting on the rock. That blood wouldn't wash off. Stayed there a long time. And everybody passed through there got scared, seeing blood on the rock where that man just fell out and died. Of course, some people got their nerves up and got scared about it, and they'd see ghosts. Some of them said something would be getting on behind the mules or horses and ride with them and spook their animals and make them jump around and scared and crazy like. So this is interesting. I've always heard oral stories from my grandfather where ghosts would follow people on a night trail, and part of me wants to side with Annie over here. If you ever walked outside late at night, it's easy to get scared of the dark. So, I think animals are very good at reading things that we don't perceive. And I think that if a human and their master gets scared, that the animal would probably follow suit and be a little bit scared. But, that's just my opinion of things. But I have heard the like of this story where ghosts follow people on animals. I thought the interesting one was get up on the horse and ride with them. People was really scared to go by that big white rock because so many people say something would get on their animal and aggravate the dickens out of them. That's another way to say something along the lines of aggravate the hell out of them in modern terms, which that might have been easy to discern. Honestly, a lot of these things might be easy to discern along the way within context. But if you're unfamiliar with Southern slang, maybe it's not. That's something I'm not really sure about, because I'm reading this from the perspective of someone who's been exposed to this language before. I was courting up there, and I had to come by there. So a courting, if I'm understanding this right, courting is an old phrase for dating. And so he's probably going to see his woman. I think this is a man, right? Yeah, Lawton Brooks, I guess that's a man. So he's probably going to see his woman, or man, who knows. Of course, I could have went around, but if I went around, it would have been further out of my way, and I decided to go by. It was raining that night, and I thought I'd just take the near cut and go through there. So he was going to take the near cut, or as we might call it, the shortcut, the near cut. When I got pretty close to where the rock was, my horse got scared and wouldn't budge nary an inch. Just bowed right up, front leg stiff like a board. That's interesting. I don't know if I understand that. I attacked him with my spur. So he's saying he spurred him, which, if you're unfamiliar, think of a cowboy's spurs, and those are used to control the animal. So attached or tacked, I'm not sure. I'm not into the equestrian world, but maybe that's an old term for digging your spurs in. I attacked him with my spur, and he jumped over to the other side of the road. Took a step or two and bowed up again. I could feel him shaking a little even. About that time I saw something white coming off the bank right down to where the rock was at and stopped. I thought to myself, you got me. I just knowed that about done me in, which means that almost I knew he would have killed me. In a sense, done me in. It would be an extreme translation to call it killed me, but got me maybe would be a good translation. Just about done me in. He just about got me. So my horse, I think he found out before I did what that thing was, and he just commenced walking along and walked right up next to it. I got me a match out of my coat pocket, because there's no such thing as flashlights in them days, and I struck me a match, and there sat a big white dog. A big old white shepherd dog was sitting there in a ditch. And if I'd have went on and hadn't never discovered what that was, I'd always said I would have seen a ghost. But I found out what it was. So I guess the moral of his story is similar to that of Annie Perry. I think that all of them have this similar moral. I think that the way they have these organized that these first set of stories are people who are skeptics, maybe in a sense they have some ghost story that they have figured out, but they do get a little better, I suppose, in a sense that they actually get somewhat scary, I guess. There's a whole section. Yeah, now here's a good one. This one is nice and scary. The This one, actually, when I read these books when I was maybe between the age of 10 and 14. Maybe that was a good guess. I think somewhere in that time. I'm 20, in my late 20s now. In the back half of my 20s, let's say. And I haven't seen these books up until recently, in over a decade or more. Easily over a decade or more. But this story that I'm about to read stuck in my mind. Like I said, I'm a cautious skeptic when it comes to these things, though I listen to people's stories with an open mind. I've always been fascinated with internet's horror stories and things. I think Reddit's No Sleep, or before it became a fiction outlet, and other outlets that are just slipping my mind at this point were what got me started many years ago. Now I listen to something called Jim Harold's Campfire and Jim Harold's Paranormal Podcast occasionally to get my fix of the supernatural. And again, I personally am a cautious skeptic, but in listening to the stories, some of them are pretty unbelievable. And I mean that in a sense that, I try to rationalize a lot of things. Because of my generally scientific outlook on the world. But I don't pretend to know that or pretend to think that I have all the answers on the other hand. And so, all that to say, I like to keep things in an open mind, and I've always, since reading these books as a kid, followed paranormal things. And as I listen to these modern stories, I keep in mind a couple of weird things that happened to me as I was a kid. And this story that I'm about to read to you has always been burnt into my mind as an example of a paranormal story. It borderlines what the experienced paranormal people would call a cryptid story. Almost, in a sense, a cryptid story. So, without further ado, I'll read it. It's actually, I think this is it. I think it's so interestingly, I've never really paid attention to the name, but Lawton Brooks. It's the same guy we just read an oral story from. And without further ado, I'll read you the story. So, Bob Meeks was his name, and he was working somewhere in Tennessee over there. He come through by Benton. While they didn't have the road then, it had to come across that mountain. I don't know whether it was Frog Mountain, whether that was the name or not, but anyway, there was 22 miles there that there wasn't no houses on it, and steep and twisty. So he's saying there was 22 miles where there were no houses, and it was steep and twisty. Oh my God. It's your modern translation. And it was late in the night. His wife had called him. Some of his kids got sick and he had to come in. And he was coming along up that mountain, and he said he'd come around the curve and he seen this thing. He said it was the biggest man he ever saw. The man stepped out of a water ditch by the side of the road and said he just leaned over a little, and as he come by, he just stepped on the running board. So I think the running board is if you have a tall vehicle nowadays, you don't really see them in sedans. But if you have like a tall SUV or pickup truck, you would see the running board. I think that's what that is. He reached down, opened the door, got in, sat down and looked him over. It was an old Model T, and the way it was going, it didn't make much more than a man walking. So this creature went and got into this man's car as he was driving, sat down and looked at him, just stared at him. He said he looked at that thing's hands, and that's what he couldn't figure out. Says its fingers, one of them was as long as two of his if they was put together, and as big again around. So he's saying his fingers were twice as long as his and twice the circumference. He said he had awful big arms, and on top of his hands he was just as hairy plumb down towards his fingers. His fingers was the longest he had seen on anybody. It must have been 10 inches long. He said he spoke to him, and he never did speak back. He said he didn't know whether he was going to do anything to him or not. He said he knowed he was big enough. So he's saying he's knowing this thing could hurt him if it wanted to. There's nothing he could have done about it. There wasn't no need to get scared, because that man could have reached plumb around him one-handed. Plumb around him would be a phrase. Plumb is kind of like, in context, it would be able to reach all around him, or be able to do all of something, in a sense. I don't know if that's the best definition of it, but he could have reached completely around him, one-handed. Big, tall man, all hairy, sorry. Said he had a beard way down and face hairy, and said he was kind of a nasty-looking old man. Said he looked as old as the hills. Said he never got a sound out of him, but he could hear him getting a breath, or him a-getting his breath, which means he could hear him breathing, but he never talked to him. He said he rode at least 3 miles with him, and he wondered if this thing was going plumb to Ducktown with him. I think Ducktown might be a little phrase. I've never heard Ducktown used figuratively, but plumb shows up again, which in this context again means he was going completely to this city with him, thinking he was going to ride the whole way. And he was going around another curve, and said this thing, man, whatever it was, just stepped out. And said he looked back, and it was just standing there in the road. Said he was the ungodliest man he ever did see in all his days of his life. He said people might not believe him, but he said it was the truth. Now I believe it, because I don't believe Bob would tell a lie. He was a man that never got excited about nothing. And after that man got out, Bob said he just kept on driving. That's funny. No, just for context, here's a picture of Lawton Brooks. I suppose they took a picture of him for this book. So imagine this man telling you the story, and this is the accent that you could apply to the story. Seems to continue. So let me see. That's kind of where I remember the story letting off. Now to me it sounds like some version of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but he said he had a beard, so that's interesting to me. It almost made me think of a werewolf story, in a sense, that this thing was some kind of half man, half beast. In some sense a cryptid, though it might not fit the description of a cryptid because I'm not an expert, but some kind of mythological beast. Or maybe he was just a really tall guy, and this poor fellow was scared, and his memory was altered. because that's the way your memory works, is that you're always just recalling your last memory of that memory. And so it can distort over time. And maybe this is like a big fish story. That's my rationalized thinking, is that this is like Annie told us earlier, just a fear that's gotten out of hand and became legend. But then again, I was not there that day, so I don't know the truth. But on with the story. And me and Walter Coleman and George went opossum hunting. So, opossum hunting. Opossum. If you're looking up the animal, it's a possum or an opossum. But Southern people generally just call them possums. Possum. Let's see, let me try to transcribe what he's saying here. And me and Walter Coleman and George went opossum hunting. Now that's the only thing I ever did that I never found out what it was. No, I didn't find out what that was now. I'll be fair with you. So I think he's talking maybe in the covering something he's about to say. As if when he's telling the story, he's preemptively telling you that he doesn't know what this is about to be. I think that's what he's trying to say. We left and it sounded like somebody taking a fit, which means kind of like having a fit. I guess, it's a pretty modern phrase. You're having a fit. Maybe having this, another way a Southern person would be, you're having a spell. Maybe you're freaking out, I think would be the most modern translation of sounds someone's freaking out. Just like somebody crying, hurting awful bad. So yeah, freaking out. Maybe they're crying out in agony or something like that. And it just commenced when we walked to where a dog treed a possum out on the ridge right there on the Hiawassee River. So he's saying a dog treat a possum, which means that you would take a dog hunting with you, and the dog is trained to chase a possum into a tree, and the possum can't escape. And then you come and shoot the possum out of the tree with your gun. So he ran a possum up a tree, and that's where it commenced. And we went out there to get the possum, so you follow the dog to go get the possum. And when we went out there, by gosh, we just walked around to the end of this old big log there. Just got a little bit past it, and something commenced. Walter said, "Lawton?" Says, "What in the world is that?" And I said, "I don't know." But I says, "Ain't that a pitiful noise?" That's something or something or another. Something or another. Hurting. Something or another. That's what this something or another. Just a phrase to mean something with extra vowels. So we took our whole lantern then and walked around the log, plumb around it, come back to the big old stump there where the tree had been sawed off. And we looked at the stump. It wasn't holler, which means it wasn't hollow. Now, you'll see this term holler used in Southern slang, like a holler is like a group of woods, like you would say the woods down there, or that holler usually kind of means like a valley where there's a wooded area, or at least that's how I've always understood it. But this is not what they're saying here. They're saying it wasn't hollow, but they're saying holler. It's a typical way of Southern speaking where the long O and A vowels get translated into ERs. It wasn't hollow. We looked in the end of the log. It wasn't hollow. So he says it again. We looked at the stump. It wasn't hollow. Looked in the end of the log. It wasn't hollow. Well, I went up to the side of the log with my lantern, shone the light all along it, couldn't see no hole in the log on either side of it. And it still sounded like somebody crying and moaning under the log. Now that's interesting. And we started a little way away from the log, to where it sounded like it was coming from now. And it sounded like it was right back there at the log. And then we'd start off out to the log again, and it'd be coming a little way from the log. And then it commenced there, right there at the log. So they're chasing this crying and moaning sound around this tree. They were perplexed that it wasn't at the log or in the log. Maybe they thought some animal had been crushed by this thing, maybe. That's just me speculating. And we never did find out what it was. We left there. We left old George and Waltner and me. We started off that mountain away from all that moaning with not a possum into a field, Old Man Smith's field. And we run right into a wire fence that we didn't know was there. Oh, I see what they're saying. Sorry. I missed the italics here. He's saying we left. We ran, and so they got spooked and they ran. We started off that mountain. All that mountain is they were running away from it, and they ran into a fence that they didn't know was there, and it really scared them because they were already spooked and they didn't know the fence was there. The way we went flying probably means the way that they got caught up and tangled up in this thing. They probably hit this thing and stopped or maybe tripped over. Or if it caught them by the ankles or something and they did a roll the way we went flying, is that what they meant? That was the only thing I ever heard, and I never did find out what it was. Why I wasn't scared so bad, but I wasn't going to stay and then boys run off and leave me. So I think he might be compensating here. He wanted to make sure that he didn't seem like a chicken, I guess, around his friends. But, this is probably many years after this story happened, so it's a funny take on it. So he's saying his friends ran away from him. And he wasn't that scared. Sure, we'll believe you, Lawrence. So he's saying they sure wouldn't stay with me. And I wasn't going to stay there and listen to it by myself, so he was a little scared. So they didn't take time to get that possum. That ends that story. So, like I said, this book is full of old stories, and there's a lot of really good, spooky stories in this. This is one of the copies. I think always hesitant to flip too quickly because my grandparents' names are written in the cover of this book, and for my protection I don't want to. And for my however you say that word, anonymity. Gosh, I still know how you say that word. I want to maintain my anonymous status to this channel, but I have a name written in here. This goes from page 324 to 362, so there's many pages. I read maybe 4. If you'd like to hear more, just let me know. I'd love to keep reading some of these, and if you're interested in something like one of these topics here, then let me know as well. I'd be happy to share and make this into some form of a series where I read these stories to you, maybe paraphrase them, because reading 20 pages on camera with a slow southern voice, slow rambling voice would take quite some time. But anyway, hope you enjoyed this video.